Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Friday Ramblings. It is Halloween spooky time, which means we're going to discuss something a little horrifying, a little creepy, and a lot of fun. And that is, of course, the Hellraiser franchise. Now, we're pretty much going to stick to the movies for right now. We'll do a brief glossing over some of the other media for context, but we're going to break down the movies. Start with Hellraiser is a British-American horror media franchise created by Clive Barker. It started with the novella The Hellbound Heart. And, as I had hinted before, does spread through various other medias. Besides, as I said, the original novella, The Hellbound Heart, that started everything. So there was a novel-length sequel to that called The Scarlet Gospels, which also featured Barker's recurring Harry D'Amour character from some of his other novels, as well as Hellraiser the Toll, which was set before The Scarlet Gospels and after The Hellbound Heart, which was written by Mark Allen Miller. Now, it should be noted both of these were written within the last 10 years, whereas The Hellbound Heart was written back in 1986. So, big chunk of time between follow-up works. There's also been an anthology called Hellbound Hearts that included a cover painted by Barker, as well as comic books that went through a variety of sources, including Epic Comics, Boom Studios, and Seraphim Inc. There's been a couple attempts at creating video games. However, they have never really come to pass as well as they should have. But as I said, we're primarily focusing on the movies today, so let's get deep down into it. Everything Hellraiser centers around two concepts that are interconnected. Connected, like puzzle pieces, fits together. Because that first concept is the lament configuration. Now, the lament configuration is a puzzle box that, due to dark sorcery, is known to open a gateway to another realm, a realm of great pain and suffering, and has existed for centuries. The puzzle box. The main people that create all the pain and suffering in this realm is that second big concept, and that is the Cenobites. Now, the Cenobites are not a classic species in and of itself. Cenobites are said to be an order of former humans who have become monsters who harvest human souls to torture in their sadistic experiments. They are essentially fallen souls. People whose need for greater and greater thrills and greater pursuits of sadomasochism have led them to completely lose their humanity. So with that being set down, let's go through the system. The original Hellraiser was created in 1987 and was directed by Clive Barker, who also worked on the screenplay as head screenwriter, which meant, yes, he was adapting his own work to film. The basics of the film is that a gentleman known as Frank Cotton, who is a wandering hedonist, buys the lament configuration. Taking it home to America, Frank sits up in his unfurnished attic, solves the puzzle, at which point hooked chains emerge, ripping him apart before the puzzle is reset and the room is restored back to normal, leaving no evidence of what happened. Sometime later, Frank's brother Larry moves into the house, intending to use this change of scenery to rebuild his relationship with his second wife, Julia. Larry is unaware that Julia had an affair with Frank before her marriage to him. And along for the ride is Larry's teenage daughter, Kirsty Cotton, who isn't really that, thrilled with her stepmother, Julia, to begin with. Now, as they are moving in, Larry cuts himself on an exposed nail while moving furniture. His blood drips on the attic floor, which serves to resurrect Frank as an undead ghoul. Frank is found by Julia, who, still having feelings for him, agrees to help restore his body so they can run away together. However, the only way to restore his body is with more blood. Julia then sets herself up as a bit of a black widow, seducing men and bringing them home so she can lure them to the attic where Frank kills them and devours their flesh, slowly regenerating his body. During this time, Frank reveals to Julia how he died, the nature of, the existence of the puzzle box, and the nature of this realm of sadomasochistic pleasures, referencing for the first time fully the Cenobites who are in charge of these tortures and torments. Eventually, Kirsty sees Julia in her acts of murderous depravity, as well as finding Frank. She manages to escape the house with the puzzle box, however collapses from shock and awakens in a hospital. Kirsty manages to solve the box, not knowing the full story of it, summoning the Cenobites, including a monster referred to as the Engineer. The Cenobites' unnamed leader, who would, as most people know if they're familiar with this franchise, eventually gain initially the unofficial but later canonized name of Pinhead, explains that although they have been perceived as both angels and demons, the Cenobites are simply explorers from another dimension, seeking carnal experiences as they can no longer differentiate between pain and pleasure. Cenobites also tend to be very ritualistic. The puzzle box was solved, a soul must be dragged to their realm. Attempting to force Kirsty to return, she informs Pinhead that, hey, if you're so great, how come Frank got away from you? As a group, the Cenobites agree to spare Kirsty if she can help them recapture Frank, but only if Frank confesses to escaping them. Again, it's a ritualistic thing. Frank must admit he intended that the reason he is no longer in the realm is he had full intent to escape from them, not some sort of forced separation himself. Kirsty returns home to find that Frank has killed Larry and taken on his identity by wearing his skin. Kirsty leaves the attic, however the Cenobites appear and, not being fooled by Frank's deception, demand Frank. Frank ultimately, in a matter of arrogance, reveals his true identity to Kirsty before deciding to kill her to complete his rejuvenation. However, as Kirsty fights back, Julia herself is accidentally stabbed, and Frank decides to drain her life instead, showing no remorse for his alleged great love, proving Frank is a jerk through and through. Ultimately, Frank and Kirsty end up back in the attic, where right as he's about to kill her, he brags about killing her father and his full plans. Thus, the Cenobites have heard the confession they need to hear. So, the Cenobites do what they do best and rip Frank to pieces before claiming his eternal soul again. Deciding they still want to take Kirsty, however, because, again, they are not moral people either. The Cenobites are stopped when Kirsty grabs the puzzle box from Julia's dead hands and manages to seal them back by reversing the sequence that opens the lament configuration to begin with. She escapes the collapsing house and attempts to burn the puzzle box. However, a vagrant, who had been seen earlier in the movie following Kirsty around, retrieves the puzzle box from the fire before turning into a demonic creature himself. At the end of the movie, the last thing we see is the puzzle box back where it started, with the merchant that sold it to Frank, who is preparing to sell it to another customer, perpetuating the cycle. Now, this first Hellraiser movie is one of the all-time great horror movies. It's the only one I'm going to go into super detail on because, frankly, this is one of the few times I'm going to say that as far as horror genre goes, this is a must-see movie. This ranks up there with the all-time greats. Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, all of them. If you have never seen Hellraiser, you need to see it. Now about the rest of the franchise. Well, let's cover this. Because while none of it is as perfect as the first movie, there are still some that are definitely worth seeing. (1988) brought us Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. Having come about only a year later, it is very highly connected to the previous film. Clive Barker wrote the story of Hellraiser 2 and served as executive producer. However, he did not direct it this time. In this one, we find out the Cenobite, now known as Pinhead, was once British military officer Elliot Spencer before he himself was a victim of the Lament configuration puzzle box. Zapping us to present time, we see that Kirsty Cotton has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital after the events of the first movie. Interviewed by Dr. Chenard and his assistant, Kylie McGray, she recounts the events of the first movie and pleads with them to destroy the bloody mattress that her stepmother Julia died on, fearing that this connection to the Cenobites and Frank could perpetuate the horrible things she barely survived. It is revealed, though, that Dr. Chenard is actually secretly obsessed with the Lament configuration and decides to instead have the mattress brought to his home, where he convinces a mentally ill patient to lie on it and cut himself with a straight razor. The resulting blood frees the now skinless Julia from the Cenobite realm, where she consumes the mental patient for life energy. Kirsty makes friends with a young mute patient named Tiffany, who demonstrates an amazing aptitude for puzzles. Holly McRae, who has witnessed Channard's murderous intentions, arrives back at the hospital and informs Kirsty he believes everything is true. Channard, meanwhile, has been seduced by Julia and brought more mentally ill patients to his home for her to feed on and regenerate. McRae is killed, Kirsty is knocked unconscious, and Channard and Julia use Tiffany to unlock the Lament configuration, where they travel to the Cenobite realm itself. Cenobites decide to spare Tiffany because it is stated that since she was forced to solve the puzzle and had no true desire to encounter the Cenobites and their unique form of pleasure, she was not part of their rules. She was merely a pawn. Pinhead recognizes this. In this dimension, we meet the entity Leviathan, which seems to have control over things. Julia herself refers to Leviathan as the god of flesh, hunger, and desire, the lord of the labyrinth. Kirsty is left alone by the Cenobites since, again, she has no desire to engage in their debauchery and is merely seeking to recover the innocent Tiffany. Julia ultimately betrays Channard, who is turned into a Cenobite himself, proving that Julia is still quite evil. Kirsty encounters Frank Cotton. However, Julia appears and destroys Frank in revenge for killing her. Julia is ultimately killed by a vortex that opens within the labyrinth, leaving only her skin behind. Kirsty and Tiffany reunite, but before they can ultimately escape, are confronted by the Cenobite Channard. Kirsty, having used Channard's research when he was immortal, reminds Pinhead of his mortal life. However, Channard appears and engages in a fight with Pinhead and the other Cenobites. Channard easily overpowers them all, though, killing Pinhead himself, or at least we think he does. When it's all said and done, though, Kirsty manages to outsmart Channard, giving Tiffany enough time to use the Lament configuration to allow them to escape. Final end credits show two moving men clearing out Channard's house, where the bloody mattress that set all this in motion is found, only for one to be killed by the mattress itself, and followed by the other witnessing a strange pillar rising from within it. This sets up the third movie, Hellraiser 3: Hell on Earth, from 1992. Now, this one, it's still a pretty good film. As I said, 2 has a good engaging plot, very connected to the original, continues the story of Kirsty Cotton and her attempts to come to terms with what happened in the first movie. Worth seeing, not going to say it's a must-see, but it is highly recommended. 3 is where things start really branching out as far as Hellraiser lore goes, though. Let's go through this one real quick. The remembrance of his own humanity causes Pinhead to be split into 2 entities. His former self, World War I British Army Captain Elliot Spencer, and the Cenobite era version of himself, Pinhead. Pinhead, however, having been defeated by Chenard, is trapped among various writhing figures etched into the surface of the Pillar of Souls that showed up at the end of the previous film. The womanizing owner of a popular nightclub buys the pillar, where it assaults various people in the club. And more people gain exposure to the puzzle box. Investigating the puzzle box's background, reporter Joanne Summerskill manages to uncover a videotape from one of Pinhead's favorite victims, Kirsty Cotton, explaining the puzzle box is the only means of returning Pinhead to hell. Ultimately, Pinhead absorbs enough victims to regain his physical body and escape the Pillar of Souls. However, without the essence of his human Elliot Spencer form, Pinhead is more of a flat-out destructive demon instead of a pursuer of sadomasochistic pleasure who, as we said in reviewing the earlier films, has a sense of ritual and rules to what he does. Pinhead uses his various victims to create a new Cenobite army, chasing reporter Joanne Summerskill. Eventually, though, the spirit of Elliot Spencer recovers from his own personal limbo, confronting Pinhead and forcibly fusing himself back into the Cenobite. This allows Miss Summerskill to escape and use the puzzle box, which is transformed into the shape of a dagger, to stab Pinhead through the heart, sending him back to hell. The box then returns Miss Summerskill to Earth, where she buries the box in a pool of concrete at a construction site. However, the construction site was merely the foundation of a building whose interior design represents the outer designs of the lament configuration itself, hinting that the power of the puzzle box still lives. This leads us into Hellraiser 4, Bloodline. This was the last series to be released theatrically, and the last to have any involvement with series creator Clive Barker, until the most recent movie, which we'll cover at the end. This movie is both a prequel and a sequel to everything else, as it bounces up and down the timeline covering various centuries. The future shows it takes place in the year 2127 and shows Dr. Paul Merchant, an engineer above a space station that he has designed. Merchant is using a robot to solve the lament configuration, who has to begin, and the doctor, found by the guards of the space station, has to explain himself, and in the process sets up our various flashbacks. It's revealed that his ancestor, Philip Le Marchand, was a French toy maker, and in 1796 was the one who created the lament configuration to begin with, due to a commission from aristocrat Duc de Laille. However, Le Marchand did not understand the full implications of the toy that he was given very specific instructions on how to build. Thus, it is the Duke himself, not Marchand, who was the original evil when it came to the creation of the puzzle box. It's shown that in this timeline, a peasant girl named Angelique, or rather they used a peasant girl to summon a demon Angelique through the box. The Marchand, realizing the evil that he had unleashed, goes home and begins working on a way to neutralize the Lament Configuration's power. Angelique, meanwhile, has lived through the centuries and works with the aristocrat and his descendants to keep the wishes of hell becoming a reality in various ways. This jumps us to 1996, where John Merchant has built a skyscraper in Manhattan that resembles the Lament Configuration. This intrigues Angelique, who goes to the United States to confront John. Who she feels poses a threat to hell. This would be the building seen at the end of the previous film. And Angelique finds the original puzzle box in the building's foundation. Angelique then tricks a security guard into solving it, summoning Pinhead, who begins to fight with Angelique, as Pinhead represents a shift in the ideologies of hell. Angelique believes in corrupting people through temptation, where Pinhead is fanatically devoted to the pain and suffering. Ultimately, though, they realize that the Merchant family is continuing to try to make amends for the creation of the puzzle block and must form an alliance to prevent the use of the Elysium configuration, which would permanently close all gateways to hell. Ultimately, John Merchant's flawed prototype fails. However, Pinhead and Angelique are sent back to hell in the process. And in 2127, Pinhead and Angelique, having been freed, attempt to stop the most recent Merchant generation. Ultimately, the Great Swerve is in, and the Elysium configuration has already been built. It is, in fact, the entire space station itself. Using technology, Dr. Merchant distracts Pinhead and the other Cenobites, activating the Elysium configuration and ending Pinhead's existence permanently. Fortunately, because all this takes place in 2127, that leaves a lot of time for Pinhead to play more games with more people. This leads into the various sequels. Hellraiser 5 Inferno, centered around a corrupt police detective who discovers the puzzle box while investigating a series of ritualistic murders, finding out that he himself may be the killer, and is confronted by Pinhead. Movie 6, Hellseeker, brought back Kirsty Cotton, revealing that she has gotten married to a gentleman named Trevor, who, after a car accident, finds he has a certain level of amnesia, and he is unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality. As time goes on, we find out that he, in fact, was having a series of affairs, and thus is suspected as having caused the crash in order to kill his wife, Kirsty, and get her out of the way. Ultimately, Pinhead shows up and reveals that not everything is what Trevor thinks, and Kirsty herself may not have escaped her encounters from the first two movies without having a little spark of wickedness planted in her own soul herself. This brings us to movie 7, Hellraiser Deader, in which reporter Amy Klein is sent to Bucharest to investigate an underground suicide cult founded by a descendant of Philip Le Marchand, who believes it is his birthright to open the puzzle box and control the Cenobites. We then come to Hell World, which mixes the worlds of virtual reality and MMORPGs, in which 5 friends who are in the middle of mourning the death of one of their fellow players who had committed suicide after becoming obsessed with a Hellraiser-based MMO have received in-game invitations to a party at the Leviathan House. Remember that reference? However, not everything is what it seems, and Pinhead and the Cenobites may be involved with a whole new form of pleasure, the pleasure of gaming. Hellraiser Revelations is the 9th film of the franchise and the first film not to feature Doug Bradley as Pinhead. And it was suggested by Bloody Disgusting the film was shot just to preserve filming rights to the Hellraiser franchise. This leads us to 2011, and the film itself is not very good. Not much of a plot to it. Group of friends finds the puzzle blocks, yada yada. 10th film is Hellraiser Judgment, which was created in 2018. And features Pinhead in hell and discussing how their methods of harvesting souls needs to be adapted in the face of advancing human technology, as it is making the old puzzle box concept obsolete. However, murder still exists in the heart of human beings, and thus there will always be those tempted to make deals with the Cenobites. Just this past year, we got a reboot film made on the Hulu film service, once again called simply Hellraiser. Now, the plans for Hellraiser remake had been involved since the late 2000s, which helped spur those rumors that the last couple Hellraiser films were put out just to secure filming rights for the eventual big money reboot. It was released in North America on Hulu, however, it was released internationally by Paramount Pictures. Now, it is not a complete remake of the first film. This serves more as a soft reboot, presenting a new plot, but one that has no continuity hinges to any of the previous films. This, understandably, as I said, it's a relatively new film. It's got mostly lukewarm receptions. Frankly, I think people are kind of burned out on the idea of Hellraiser. And the fact that nothing really creative has been done with it in a long time. Now, it should be noted that Clive Barker did help work on the writing for this new reboot, so that does help its legitimacy. However, let's be honest, the first 4 films basically told the saga. Yes, as I said, because that final death of the Cenobites took place far in the future, it did leave the door open, but except for the whole thing about mixing the Cenobites with the MMOs and the whole addictive, obsessive nature of online video gaming, the movies are really just a lot of the same old stuff after those first few. Still, there are people that cannot get enough Pinhead. So, you know what? I'm not going to diss the franchise. I know people worked really hard on these films. And I'm sure everybody involved, both in front of and behind the camera, worked very hard to make these films as good as they possibly could be under the circumstances. Certainly with the lack of theatrical releases, that was going to hurt budgets. And with that, you're going to lose resources. Still, when it's all said and done, the idea of Hellraiser is brilliant. The character of Pinhead is one of the true icons of horror, and those first few films are all big recommendations. Starting with 5 on, if you need something you haven't seen before to watch in October, or any other time of the year you feel a bit of a horror vibe coming on, why not? Frankly, there's worse things out there. So, I will say this though. There's always hope that someday somebody will come up with something really, truly awesome that they can do to add to the Hellraiser lore. And if you can come up with a seriously good plot, hey, you'll have my attention. Those, a good idea, a good lore, never really dies. No matter how many bad ideas are done with it, or how often films are churned out just for legal control issues, you only need one really excellent film to revive a franchise. Because after all, we are talking horror, we are talking Halloween, and that means nothing stays dead forever. With that in mind, we'll see you in 7.